What's up, everyone, and welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. I am the co-host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and I'm joined by the other co-host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
Hello, Kyle. Everyone else, how's it going?
I'm doing well. It's been a busy week, Will, and as people could tell, I don't really have the usual studio set up here, but doing the best I can with the limited resources I currently have with me to put out a great show for everybody today. I think we have a lot of great stuff to talk about today, Will, but just a few housekeeping things to start. Everybody, make sure you're subscribing to the YouTube channel. It's Conflicts of Interest. Link in the show notes page. And in fact, if you watch the video, I usually have it set up at the end, so the last few seconds it pops up on the screen that you could just hit subscribe right on the video itself. If you're not a YouTube listener at all, make sure you just subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and then you could give the show a rating and review. We've had, I think, over 20 ratings now and 5 or 6 really nice reviews from you fans, and we really appreciate it. Very kind words, and we hope that everybody feels the way about the show that the people who are giving us feedback are giving, because everybody's saying they really love it, and so yeah, me and Will just plan on keep doing this and hopefully bringing you all the news. Let's get rolling here, Will. The first story we have today, one that at first I was going to ignore because it kind of sounds like a clickbaity headline. DOJ designates New York City as anarchist jurisdiction. This didn't jump out to me as any kind of official legal term or anything, Will. And I was like, oh, this is just something that Donald Trump had Bob Barr do to score a couple political points against his political, rival now, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. And then I heard Cuomo respond to this, and he was like irate and very, very mad about it. And so I thought, maybe there is something to look into here. And it does seem that this is more than just some, meaningless label that's being applied to New York City. So, Will, can you give us a few details on what an anarchist jurisdiction is and what that means?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, unfortunately, like if only we really did have anarchist jurisdictions here. This term they're using, this is something Trump had like floated before. He'd used this term previously as well, anarchist jurisdictions. But on Monday, the DOJ has actually gone through and slapped this label on New York City, on Portland, and Seattle. And they're basically accusing these cities of basically allowing like lawlessness and violence in the form of the protests and the rioting and stuff. And they're saying that city authorities basically prevented police from doing their jobs to restore order. And so in response to that, the DOJ and the feds are now saying that New York City, Portland, and Seattle will no longer qualify for certain types of federal funding and grants and stuff until they stop being so-called anarchist jurisdictions and allow police, I guess, to enforce certain laws. They are defining this kind of broadly, though. Like, in addition to the cities that don't crack down on the protests and rioting enough to satisfy the DOJ, the feds can also now slap this label on cities that have cut police funding recently, or even refused a deployment of federal agents to manage the protests. And then there's also too, if you read the DOJ's actual release, there's this catch-all provision they put in there that just says quote, any other related factors the Attorney General deems appropriate. So you could kind of drive like a truck through this definition here. It's a very broad thing, but so far they've only slapped these 3 cities with it: New York City, Portland, and Seattle. With New York City, they're mainly pointing to the there's been a major police budget cut recently, where the city council agreed to slash I think $1 billion from the NYPD's usual massive $6 billion budget. And then there's also in New York, I think the DOJ is saying that New York didn't enforce or didn't crack down on the looting and rioting and stuff that we've seen over the last couple months. And for New York City in particular, this is going to be a pretty big deal because these federal grants make up a fairly large portion of the city's budget. I think it's $7 billion of their revenue they get through these federal grants and federal funds. So that could be a pretty big deal for them. But then in terms of Portland, obviously they're pointing to the more than 100 days of protests that have gone on in that city, which have pretty often escalated into rioting and violence and clashes with the cops. That's also the city where they deployed federal agents over the summer. So that's kind of a no-brainer for why they choose that city to call an anarchist jurisdiction. And then Seattle, they're referring to the autonomous protester zone thing that the city allowed the activists to set up over the summer, which they kept for a month. In that case, with they called it Chaz at first, and they later called it CHOP for the Capitol Hill occupied protest, referring to a neighborhood in Seattle of Capitol Hill, not like DC, of course. But the mayor of Seattle really kind of embarrassed herself with that whole protester zone thing. She like fully allowed that to happen. She even sent city workers in there to go build concrete barricades for the CHOP zone. There's photos on Reuters you can see of these guys in yellow vests, like, constructing these concrete barricades. And then she also said it was going to be a summer of love and all this stuff. But you ended up having like 5 different shootings in that protest zone in the space of like a month, where I think 2 teenagers were actually killed too. One 19-year-old, one 16-year-old. So that's why they're hitting Seattle with this, is over that whole autonomous zone thing, which actually Bill Barr, the attorney general, he recently said that Jenny Durkin, the mayor of Seattle, could face criminal charges for allowing that to happen. So like that's kind of a big deal. But apparently that's also why they've hit Seattle with this anarchist jurisdiction thing. So that's basically the deal, is that the DOJ has slapped this new designation to these 3 cities, and they may pull federal funding from them.
Yeah, so I have a couple just follow. I don't think you have answers for these. As far as I could tell, there wasn't like a official definition. It's not like crime increases by 30% over a 6-month period, then you're in anarchist jurisdiction. Crime goes down by 10% over a 3-month period. That means you get off the list. It doesn't seem like there's any kind of official designation, labels, stats, metrics being used here, and so it's seems pretty inherently political to me. Was that the same impression you got, Will?
Well, I think the DOJ did lay down some like very vague and broad guidelines, but like I'm saying too, the very last guideline is, or any other factors the attorney general decides that, but no, like you're saying, there's no like, quantitative metrics or anything in terms of how crime. It's really all kind of qualitative, like are the governments doing enough to take on the protests? So yeah, ultimately, like this is a very political designation. They could pretty much slap on any, Democrat city that they want.
And as you mentioned there, that while the police budget, I think you said is like $6 billion a year, and they're looking at cutting it. Overall, the city could lose like $7 billion in federal grants, and so these aren't just, I guess, law enforcement grants, which is what I thought when I initially read this. But it has to be grants outside of law enforcement. I guess it could be all criminal justice or something. But that's a substantial amount of money, $7 billion in a city that anybody who watches at least any non-CNN news will know that city is really struggling financially right now. Their tax base is gone. Cuomo's begging the rich people to come back, and they don't seem to want to do it. So taking $7 billion, there's going to be a lot of corrupt city officials who are really mad about their tape being cut down, I would assume.
Yeah, no kidding. A little bit less graft, I guess, going on there.
Right. A couple other things. I do know that one of the parents of the dead teenagers is suing the Portland or Seattle mayor for not, enforcing that the CHOP and allowing that to happen. And so,
Right,
there is this really interesting concept that I do think is worth talking about a little bit here, and that is, the police and the governments really have, as ANCAPs will say, a monopoly on violence, but they also have a monopoly on justice, and this includes who actually gets the right, real kind of justice. And so, looking at all these store owners who had their stores broken into, but then the police didn't defend their stores. Really, nobody bothers to like do anything to prevent the looting, and yet you have like 400 police officers around the courthouse or something like that, or they're just set up in random places around town. And so I think that is a real problem, and so this is like an attempt to address that in some way, which seems to be like not all a bad thing. That like, hey, if you're saying that, especially in these cities like New York City, where it's hard to get a gun and actually provide defense for yourself, I mean, hell, I think it's like if you want to go defend your store with a bat, that seems more dangerous than not defending it at all. You know what I mean? Then like people are just gonna mob you and come at you. At least if you have a gun, that's usually a serious enough deterrent to back a lot of people off, like from just being mobbed and stuff like that. But if you can't get yourself a firearm in New York City, there's absolutely nothing you could do to defend yourself right now. We all remember these transcripts from 911 calls that we got over the summer from New York City, where residents were calling and the dispatchers were basically telling them good luck with that. And
Yeah.
I understand from the dispatcher's point of view, what are you gonna do? But you have to in some way be able to provide some security for people if you're the government and don't allow them to provide security for themselves. And my guess is that this is going to be somewhat of a popular move by the Trump administration. As much as I don't like, arbitrary federal, dictates coming to cities about, how aggressively their police have to act. At the same time, you can't just let people's whole lives be taken away by roaming mobs of looters and rioters. And that's what's happened in a lot of cities. And that, that's also a problem. And so, don't send the police to every corner in the inner city to police drug laws, but please stop people from burning down businesses. And they won't do that. So it'll be interesting to see, I guess, if this does provoke some kind of action. But my guess will be this will be turned into like a political football. And if anything, these cities will do a little bit less just because it will, be anti-Trump.
Right, right. Yeah, what you're talking about here kind of reminds me of this concept they call anarcho-tyranny, where it's like the state has the monopoly on violence and, like you're saying, the monopoly on justice, but then they don't use it. They like, they create, they crowd out all the other security agencies, and then they allow the criminals and stuff to run rampant, which is kind of what's, definitely in the case of that chop zone. Like you also had lawsuits from the local businesses suing the city, saying that like you let these people just like run amok and destroy my livelihood. Like how, like I don't know, that's not okay, I think. But then the other thing in terms of like the federal funding, like I'm also not cool with seeing the feds like say, telling localities that, hey, your police have to crack down. But I also am not like, I don't care if the feds pull the funding from these cities. I don't think these cities are entitled to federal dollars. So I would rather those tax dollars be returned to their rightful owners in the private economy. But nonetheless, I'm not like going to cry too hard if they're pulling federal funding from these cities. Like, big deal.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is that the consequence of this isn't anything that we could necessarily be opposed to as libertarians. I guess
Yeah.
the last thing I just wanted to point out is that by the police not doing what they're apparently supposed to be there to do, it does put citizens in more kind of conflict with each other, and you end up with situations like Kyle Rittenhouse, where it now seems more clear that mobs of people, including a crazed guy named Rosenbaum, just like rushed the kid, and and then he fired and people died, and it's a real tragedy. I'm not trying to say that it's not, but just the point that had police officers defend the businesses in Kenosha, Kyle wouldn't have been out there. That seems fairly clear that he didn't go up there like as a member of a militia, that some business person, I guess, had asked him to like come over and help to watch the business or something like that. And assuming that the cops would have stood out there, I'm guessing that no business owner says, "Boy, I'd rather have a 17-year-old with an AR standing out front than a police officer." Like, let's be real. Like, even with the state of American police officers today and how abusive and terrible these people are, a lot of times, I think we would all probably take an adult who has some known training over a 17-year-old with a rifle, where there's maybe him on a personal level, so you have an idea of how he can handle the gun, but as a 17-year-old, just thinking myself as 17, there's no way I'd take myself to stand out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't know anything else. Well,
No, I think we hit on all the points on the anarchist jurisdictions. It's too bad they're not actually anarchist jurisdictions, as I think we would actually kind of want to see, stateless, functioning societies.
right. I think the first step you have to look at is, getting rid of the nonviolent laws, the gun laws, the drug laws, the, other kind of sin laws like prostitution and stuff like that. And
Absolutely.
and then I think the transition to a anarchist jurisdiction where people have their own kind of security force things is far closer. Although I do know that, like, if you're not an ANCAP and you hear that, that might sound kind of overwhelming to want anarchist jurisdiction in a time where, a lack of police presence is causing problems. The problem is that the police are also going to enforce gun laws and stuff like that during this time, and so they don't give you a chance to protect yourself, and there's nobody to protect you. So it's the worst kind of chaos anarchy, not the, un hierarchy of power that me and Will oppose.
Right.
All right, getting into some stories on Afghanistan here. We got some updates, and this is something that we'll continue to cover on conflicts of interest. Is what happens as Trump is apparently looking to wind down the Afghan war. There's two things going on related to Afghanistan. Some of it is happening in the country of Qatar, and those are the talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And then there's the actual fighting and war going on in Afghanistan, and neither of these things seem to be going particularly well. Two stories here from antiwar.com. The first by Dave DeCamp. Afghanistan, over 100 killed in deadliest clashes since intra-Iran Afghan talks begin. And, Dave estimates 57 Afghan government fighters and 80 Taliban fighters reportedly being killed across the country. Looking at those numbers, and this isn't something I was able to measure for sure, and oftentimes the reports of Taliban casualties seem pretty inflated because it's just the Afghan government giving the numbers, and then the Taliban of course always claim like 2 of their soldiers died or something like that. So I don't think that the reporting on those numbers are ever very accurate, but this is some of the deadliest fighting we've seen in Afghanistan this year, and is coming just weeks after official talks begin between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And then the other story we have here is from Jason Ditz, which is Taliban and Afghan government far apart on basic issues at talks. And so it seems like bad news all around here. Will, where do you want to start with this? The clashes in Afghanistan?
I suppose we could start with the talks. I think we can get into the clashes in just a sec. Like the last time we had talked about this on the show, there was very little reporting on the actual negotiations. They'd kind of just started, and there were some delays and stuff. But now, as you're pointing this Jason Ditz story, like we are getting a little bit of information, and unfortunately, it's not sounding too great. Right off the bat. The story that Jason based his on was at Reuters, and this Reuters piece, they talked to some negotiators and some diplomats who were there in Qatar. And they're saying, like you said, the Taliban and the government are still far apart on a lot of basic issues, on just like on the ceasefire being the major one. That's like the major goal of these talks. But then also on other sort of side issues like women's rights and how the Afghan political system will work, and exactly how Islamic law factors into all that. So there's a lot of big disagreements apparently between the two sides here. They have not quite hammered much of this out. However, with this, the Reuters write-up was like with the major one that I was seeing in terms of like the progress of the talks. But when I read that one, I'm a little skeptical, because like they're mostly citing negotiators on the government side and not really letting anyone from the Taliban side have much of a say. So I don't think it's so totally fair to like let them just paint the whole picture, let the government side do that. But at the same time, though, like what they're saying is not that hard to believe, honestly. Like, I don't think anyone expected them to sit down and immediately hammer out a deal right away. And I kind of expected the first few weeks would kind of be rough, and that, the major thing I'm just hoping is that nobody loses their cool in this stage and like walks out on the whole thing before they can start hammering those things out. Because again, like I would expect there to be an initial period of like, disagreement and all this stuff. But as far as I understand, in the talks themselves right now, the Afghan government wants to focus on the ceasefire. They're putting that front and center in the negotiations. Whereas the Taliban kind of wants to put that on the back burner. They'd rather focus on some of the broader issues, like the political system and how that will all work. They're saying, the Taliban is saying it'd make way more sense to negotiate that kind of stuff, like to figure out these more complicated issues, and then we can figure out how to stop the fighting after we get those things squared away. But unfortunately, as you were pointing to, there's been a lot of violence in Afghanistan, like even just since the talks started. Like on the first few days, you had the Afghan government saying the Taliban was still launching attacks. You kind of referenced this. I sometimes am skeptical or doubt like what the Afghan government's saying. I think sometimes they overstate casualties, or they overplay certain things the Taliban does. But I think Sunday we had like a really bloody day of clashes. There was, like you said, like nearly 60 government troops killed. There was clashes all around the country too. It wasn't just like confined in one area. And there was a ton of Taliban fighters. I'd seen some reports saying 80. And then just a few days prior to that, over the weekend, the government had bombed the home of a Taliban guy and killed a bunch of civilians. I saw some reports saying up to 24. So that certainly does not help anything. Those kind of operations and attacks. Again, that number of 24, maybe that's sort of these numbers are all kind of sketchy. It's not always clear, but 24 civilians dying, that is not helpful for these talks as they go forward. So even as they are trying to work out the ceasefire here, there's still a lot of violence in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, I think that is one of the ways the Taliban kind of has leverage, is like the threat of being able to carry out attacks and ambushes and stuff. So that might actually even explain part of their reluctance to like immediately resolve the ceasefire issue, that they kind of want to keep some wiggle room a little bit before they straight up commit themselves to anything on that front. But then the government, though, they're feeling the opposite pressure. Like they want to get the ceasefire hammered out right away, because the U.S. is set to withdraw from Afghanistan in the spring, in like April or May, and then they'll no longer have that protection. So there's like very different motivations, I think, driving both sides in the talks right now. But before I become really pessimistic, I'll give them more time. Like I think it's a little early to just like say it's all hopeless at this stage.
All right, so white pill from Will here. Um, I guess one of the things, I think you bring up a good point, and just to clarify that this is just from government sources, and so it doesn't necessarily surprise me they're playing up the women's right as being a key issue, because it plays so well in the Western press that you have these backwards terrorist hillbillies, the Taliban. They're just so unreasonable, and it's the civilized Afghan government that we need to make sure, that we don't have like some FGM going on in Afghanistan, or honor killings and stuff like that. And some of this is real issues, like out in especially like the tribal areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan. I don't know as much about the first thing I said, but definitely the honor killings and stuff are an issue. And so I'm not saying there's not issues here, but it does seem to be something that maybe they're putting front and center, rather than like what a future government is going to look like, who's going to be president, what political power the Taliban will have. Maybe something they're not as interested in playing up as being a key difference, because it sounds like, somewhere the Afghan government has to negotiate, rather than, again, just the incredibly impossible Taliban. Looking and talking about just some of the violence in the country, one of the things that just tends to happen if two sides are like engaging in talks about a ceasefire, typically fighting on the ground actually gets worse during that time. And in part it's because you get more leverage if you have more territory. Also, let's say you're some Taliban fighter, right? And your village is one that's kind of still in Afghan government control. Well, if the lines get set and then you permanently had to like live on that side of the line or something like that, you really want to take your village back. And so I think that maybe accounts for why the fighting is so widespread right now, is either it's like a personal interest like that, like you're personally trying to liberate your home village, or it's some local Taliban warlord trying to extend his fiefdom a little bit. This needs to be done soon, or else it can't be done at all. So that's one of the things that happens. And so the unfortunate thing then is that if fighting increases, you're more likely to run into a scenario where either the numbers get so bad that one side ends up pulling out, or something happens like you end up killing too many civilians in one attack, or like an American gets killed, and that could throw everything into turmoil. And so for me, that seemed to be kind of the thing that stuck out most to me, which is terribly sad, right? That we're talking about 150 or so people dying in Afghanistan. This story, 19 years after 9/11 has happened, in fighting, not by a whole bunch of Americans here, but certainly fueled by the American empire. And those lives really don't impact all that much when you look at the grand scheme of things. But if a single American soldier had been killed by the Taliban, it could have caused a major shift in American policy and thrown this whole situation into discord and chaos. And that's one of the things that just concerns me looking at this is if violence is this high, it could eventually result in not necessarily intentional, but somehow an American soldier getting killed. And unfortunately in Afghanistan, that's a life that matters a hell of a lot more than the rest of them as far as international policy goes, and how that's going to affect Afghanistan. And so yeah, I'm worried about something like that happening with violence being this widespread.
Yeah, that is a major concern that, yeah, an American or, another type of foreign national would get caught up in one of these, but especially an American. That's a major risk that could derail this whole thing, like you're saying.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's usually only like the Western soldiers that get this treatment. Occasionally, they'll kidnap some, Western members of human rights organizations. It does get headlines, and the U.S. does work to get those people back. But nothing changes U.S. policy like a dead American soldier. But like you said, there are some NATO, international forces, and I'm sure a dead French soldier or Dutch soldier would result in about the same reaction. Well, I had one here that I came across not too long before we were recording, and it sounds like a great headline. Official: Pentagon has started prudent planning for full Afghan withdrawal by May. So you read that headline and you think, well, that sounds pretty good. But then you read the story, and every single official cited in the story makes it absolutely clear that Trump hasn't given any kind of orders at all. There's just this deal that the U.S. made with the Taliban that says we're going to have, I think they said, 0 service members in Afghanistan May 2021. But they always say if conditions warranted and things like that to make it very clear that the order hasn't been given yet, and that there are a lot of situations where that order will not be given, and that these plans are just being carried out, and the potential that we get out, but there's no real reason to think that we will at this point. The other thing is that there's the big election in November between now and May of 2021, and it doesn't seem like Joe Biden will stick with this plan. He's been pretty clear that while he wants to draw down the endless wars, he doesn't necessarily want to end them. He doesn't want to pull all U.S. forces out of the Middle East. He's, has to take, I guess, if he feels like a contrary position to Trump. And so, especially with the hawkish people around him like Michelle Flournoy, it's not surprising at all that his take is we can't get all of the soldiers out. We have to leave them there and essentially make sure this war continues forever. And so, with that, and then again, the high violence potential for a U.S. troop death, I'm not exactly holding my breath that all U.S. soldiers are going to get out of Afghanistan in May of 2021. However, the Pentagon actually taking the time to draw up serious plans for this is a bit of a improvement over most situations where they would absolutely drag their feet on drawing up any kind of realistic plans to withdraw American forces from anywhere, because if the plans are there to do it, then it could actually happen one day. So maybe this is a little bit of good news, but I haven't read too much into it so far, but I do see a lot of people getting a little bit excited over this.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely encouraging development here that at least they're drawing up the plans at all. Like, like you're saying, they're not, there's been no orders given to withdraw to this level yet, to 0. And I think they are going to make it more like conditions based in this last final leg of troops. But nonetheless, like, yeah, they are at least, planning for it. So, that's certainly, Trump can give the order and sometimes they still don't do it. So it seems in like Syria. But in this case, it does seem like they are, at least at most, or at the very least, reluctantly going forward with that.
Right. Just the last thing I'll note is that I think some of this came out in House Oversight and Reform Subcommittee for National Security. And it seems like Congress is taking an active role in this. And if we've seen Congress do anything under the Trump administration, it's try to keep U.S. troops in different countries and stuff like that. And so I'm not even sure that Congress won't present a barrier here as the U.S. tries to get out. Although, I was just reading before we came on a story I believe that you wrote up just probably an hour or so ago that there's still no evidence about these bounties in Afghanistan, at least. And so, I don't know, Tammy Duckworth is still doing her daily. It's been 90 days, and Donald Trump still hasn't done anything to the Russians about the bounties in Afghanistan. But if the Pentagon can't present the Congress any evidence to go along with that, that seems like some good news to me.
Yeah, yeah, it's actually interesting. It's the story you're citing about the Pentagon officials saying that they're planning for a full withdrawal. The guy they're citing there, David Halvey, I think his name is. That's the same guy who was asked during the same committee hearing. Actually, he was asked about the Russian bounties thing that the New York Times reported, and like, have you seen any evidence of that? And yeah, he also is saying that nope, we still have not seen any evidence of that at all. And interestingly, actually, Zalmay Khalilzad, the like top U.S. envoy to Afghanistan, during that same hearing, he was also asked about like, is Russia doing anything? Are there any external actors trying to like work against the U.S. peace process there? And Khalilzad was like, no, I mean the Russians have been supportive of the diplomatic efforts in Afghanistan. So that really is like cutting against this whole like resistance narrative about the Russians in Afghanistan.
All right, well, let's take a minute to talk about our sponsor, Paloma
Yeah.
Verde. What they do is they sell great CBD products. Go online and check out their store, PALOMABERDE store, STORE.com. And when you go to their website, you could look at all their great products. Not only do they have great CBD products, they also have just education on CBD. So, a lot of people have already asked me, like, hey, can I take CBD and still pass the drug test? And the answer, I think, in all cases is yes, because they test for THC, and all the Paloma Verde products are labeled THC free. They won't get you high or anything like that. I just want to say I'm in the process of moving, and that means I've been lifting a lot of stuff. And, I got some sore muscles. The CBD doesn't take care of that. But now that I'm becoming an old man too, I get like really, really like, bad pain and stuff like that. The CBD has been helping to fight the inflammation and, making it so I'm not in so much pain all the time. And it's pretty great. And it's easy to take. There's a couple things that Carlos, the owner of Paloma Verde, sent me. It's the soft gels, which I think are probably my second favorite product to use. The extract, which is definitely my favorite product to use. Just take the little dipper, get a milligram of it. It's stick in your mouth, easy to use. And then there's also the gummies, which are great as well. So make sure everybody checks out Paloma Verde store.com. You use the code PEACE, PEACE, easy to remember. Just like conflicts of interest, Paloma Verde has a nice green dove as their logo. So easy to remember the peace thing. And you get 25% off if you spend $75 on your order. And then you could also get an extra 10% off your first order if you sign up for the mailing list at PalomaVerdeStore.com. Will, should we get back to the show?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, the next story we have here is about Bolivia. And Will, I believe you wrote this one up, so I'll go ahead and let you talk about it. But it's at RT as Bolivia's interim president withdraws from an upcoming election one day after polls show pro Morales candidate in the lead.
Yeah, yeah. So we don't cover Latin America stuff all that often, but maybe we should be covering that region of the world a little more. But I thought this development was very interesting, and it does kind of tie into some stuff that we had covered on your previous show, Foreign Policy Focus in Bolivia. So we have the current so-called interim or acting president of Bolivia, Jeanine Anez, who abruptly dropped out of the presidential race kind of at the last minute. Like there's like the election is next month, so there's just a couple weeks left. And so she suddenly pulled out. She hadn't really given much indication she was going to do that. But she basically cited the same exact reason that you saw like during the U.S. primary when you saw all those Democrats suddenly drop out right around Super Tuesday. The whole idea was to consolidate support around a candidate that has a better chance of winning. So in the U.S. case, obviously that was Joe Biden, but in Bolivia's case, that was Carlos Mesa, who's this like center-left guy who had actually been the runner-up in the previous election last year, which was this big controversial thing that was all disputed. But we'll get to that in a second. But I think the clear explanation behind Anez dropping out is this recent poll that came out. Like in my headline there, it says one day before she pulled out of the race. But these poll numbers showed that this guy Luis Arce was like way in the lead. Like he had like 40% of the vote, like a massive plurality. And like were he to actually get those poll numbers in the real election, he would win in the first round. Like there wouldn't even be a runoff election between the top two candidates. Because in Bolivia, like if you get 40% of the vote at least, as well as a 10-point lead over the runner-up, the guy in second place, then you just win in the first round. There's no runoff race that they do there. So this poll data really shows this guy's way in the lead. And the interesting thing about this Arce guy is that he is in Evo Morales' former party, the Movement for Socialism. And Evo Morales being the president who was actually like basically ousted from office in what I think you would basically call a U.S.-backed coup last year after the last election.
No doubt.
Yeah, I think you really could characterize as that. So, I think this is obviously why Anez is dropping out suddenly. She's trying to throw support to Carlos Mesa in order to prevent Morales' party from coming back to take power after they just got rid of them in the last election, basically. And the whole thing with the last race was like very shady. Like, like it was right at the end of the vote. They were counting the ballots, and there was like a brief delay in reporting the numbers that the government did. And then a short time later, the final tally showed that Morales had indeed won. He had just edged out Carlos Mesa for the win. But the opposition started saying that delay in reporting the results, that was somehow like proof that the result was rigged and that they tampered with the numbers. And pretty soon after they started saying that, you had the Organization of American States, or the OAS, which is like this regional bloc of Latin American countries it's headquartered in Washington, D.C. It's heavily funded with U.S. tax dollars, like primarily funded by the U.S., and it pretty reliably takes the U.S. line on pretty much every important issue under the sun. And so this organization, the OAS, started saying that there were irregularities in the vote, and they eventually released this report straight up saying that like the result couldn't be trusted, that it was rigged and not legit. And then the U.S. every step along the way, like pretty much put its rhetorical support behind that. It endorsed the OAS's findings and all that stuff. And at the time, Morales had agreed to a new election. He said like he was down to have another vote. But at that point, there were already these huge opposition protests in the streets, and the military at one point actually basically forced Morales to resign. Like they backed the opposition, and at that point, Morales actually fled the country because I guess after the military kind of turned on him, he felt that he was not safe in Bolivia anymore. But just to me, I think the fact that the front runner of the current race is a Morales loyalist, and he's running under his party, the Movement for Socialism, I think that's fairly significant. That 1 year after Morales was removed from power, it seems that a pretty large segment of the country is still pretty firmly in his camp. And this so-called interim president, Jeanine Anez, is like scrambling now to make sure he doesn't win by dropping out. And the last thing I'll say, the funny thing about Anez too, is that she never actually was elected in the first place. She never won an election. After Morales was like forced out of the country, she just declared herself president. And at the time she was like a senior figure in the Senate. And she wasn't actually in the line of succession, like the way that in the U.S., if like the president is taken out and the VP, then like you go to the Speaker of the House or whatever. She was not in the line of succession. She just declared herself the president, and then the Senate voted without a quorum to confirm her, and she's just been in power ever since. Like she's just stayed there. No one's really challenged it. But now it seems that we have some of these poll numbers coming out. Bolivians are not a fan of this Anez lady, and now she will not get a chance to be elected because she's now dropped out of the race. So that's the deal there.
Well, one of the things I remember from the 2019 election, which Morales was, ends up being couped, after winning, is that there's this like a weird election rule, at least by American standards in Bolivia, where you could win with 40% of the vote, but then you have to beat your next closest challenger by 10% of the vote. Yeah. So you have to get 40 and they have to get less than 30. And so it seemed to me that, maybe while people look at this polling, it doesn't, because I think the like leading guy had like 25 or 30, and then Anez had about 10, and then the other candidate had over 40. And so it seemed to me that the clear strategy is to make up that difference. So there has to be, I guess, some kind of runoff election. And I guess they would hope that they end up with a majority of support and could legitimize some kind of coup government by winning an election here, but it seems like the problem that if you're going to have a democracy with legitimate elections, then if the people go out and vote and they want to vote for this reformist loose socialist party of Morales, then how many coups and new elections are you going to have? My fear is that they will exploit like coronavirus to just back up the election if they don't think they're gonna win. We can't do it in December. There's a COVID spike. They they'll test 100,000 people in a week and find 50,000 of them get test positive for COVID, and then they'll claim that it's a catastrophe and postpone the election by another 6 months. Um, and as you point out, that we're now like coming up on a year almost post coup, and it's still the coup government that's in charge. So, it kind of shows that this isn't about democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the funny thing too is that like Anez, you said like she had like 10% in that poll, and Mesa, the guy in second place, he has like 20 something percent. But it's not totally clear that Anez's 10% will go straight to Mesa. Anez is like a conservative, like Christian, like theocrat type of figure, whereas Mesa is like a center left figure. So it's not totally clear that all of Anez's supporters are just going to jump right over to Mesa. So that whole gambit they're trying to play there, that might not even win. And yeah, if Morales' guy, if the guy into that party, if he wins, then like I would not be surprised if you do start seeing the OAS start speaking up again and issuing reports about irregularities and all this stuff. So I would watch for that for sure.
Well, I guess it's good to know that it's not a particularly unique feature of a politician to, I guess, essentially believe that whoever will vote for you will just do whatever you want. And so
Right.
anybody who will vote for Bernie Sanders will vote for Hillary Clinton. Anybody who, vote for any of these other Democratic candidates, Tulsi Gabbard or whoever, Elizabeth Warren will vote for Joe Biden, and they just assume that that's the way that democracy works. Like, you support a candidate, but if that candidate says support somebody else, you're just going to do that without thinking about the policies of that candidate or anything else. And it's good to see that the South American politicians had that same issue. I'm sure it's just a political thing overall. But let's move on here to the last story we have for the day, which
Yeah.
is the U.S. envoy, or the U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, made a quite interesting statement on a story that we have been updating as it goes along. And we have, I guess, in the past week, they signed the Abraham Accords, which is supposed to be the normalization agreements between the UAE and Bahrain with Israel. And what each side is getting out of this, because they weren't at war, so they call it a peace deal, but these countries were never at war, and in fact cooperated on international and security issues and stuff in the recent past. So but anyways, they claim they're signing a peace deal, and it's basically about getting F-35s for the Arab countries. And then the UAE said they got one other thing out of the deal, and that was a suspension of Israel's planned annexation of the West Bank. The Palestinians didn't buy it. We didn't buy it at the time. And now the U.S. ambassador to Israel says that was a good call, because Israel will be going ahead with the annexation anyways. He says, I think it will happen. It was just a temporary suspension. And, annexation will happen at some point, I'm guessing, when it's politically advantageous for Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, like you had the Emiratis, like I think they tried to pay some kind of lip service that, oh, this deal would somehow like post or like forestall annexation. But I mean, very early on, you even had Netanyahu like right after the deal saying like this is all still on the table. We're not like he never publicly committed to not annexing to not annex the West Bank. We actually had over the summer reports like it seemed like the Israelis were like imminently about to annex the West Bank, or at least some large chunk of it, the settlements, like a third of the West Bank, I believe it was. But there started being reports that the Israelis were kind of like stalling, and that it was largely over the American position, that like the U.S. was kind of saying like, we're not totally ready for you to do this yet. I suspect maybe because the Trump team was thinking that maybe it's a little too close to the election to do this, to shake things up with this kind of like big Israel move, which like could earn Trump some support from some like pro-Israel people, but maybe it's just a little too risky. They didn't want to push it through right away. But like to me, it really says a lot that you have the U.S. ambassador basically saying like this is definitely still going to happen, because the Israelis it's not as if the U.S. completely like dictates or controls their policy or something. In fact, you might say it's sort of the other way around. But I definitely think the U.S. position on this question is very important to the Israelis, And if the U.S. is saying that, like, because Friedman said that we're still for this is still part of Trump's like peace plan or whatever, that the Israelis would annex some of the settlements. And so I don't know. I think it's very significant that the ambassador is saying that, like, yeah, this is probably still going to go ahead, because the U.S. could, I think, if they wanted to, say like, we don't want this to happen, and like it's too soon or whatever. Like, there's a lot of arguments they could come up with to convince the Israelis not to. But now that the U.S. ambassador is saying like, yeah, this will probably happen, I think that's a pretty good sign that it will. I guess the real question is just a matter of when they're going to do it. I get the feeling that Trump wants to wait until after the election. He'd rather do this during his second term. But of course, the Israelis are probably a little bit anxious about that, because if Trump doesn't win, then they won't have quite as staunch of an advocate in the White House. But even if Biden wins, I don't see him like making this a big fight. I don't see, like, he might try to like get some concessions out of the Israelis or something in exchange for some kind of annexation. But I don't think Biden would make this a big principled stand to oppose the Israelis. I think you'd largely see a lot of what you saw with Obama, which is like very mealy mouthed, like, sometimes kind of opposing them in rhetoric, but like that's about it. Like nothing really substantial. As they say, no daylight between between the U.S. and Israeli policy. I think Biden would continue that.
Right. Yeah. Just a couple things you said there. I wanted to comment on. The first is just, yeah, I think it's probably wait until after the election to hear the narrative from a lot of people, even some Democrats conceding that like Trump is like creating a peace plan here and bringing peace to the Middle East. So we're really cut against that if suddenly there were, a whole bunch of Palestinians running around acting violently because the Israelis are, stealing another third of their remaining territory. I mean, like, that's not
a new intifada, yeah.
Right. Even if like just the portrayal in the Western media is that these, enraged brown people keep killing all the nice white democratic white people of the Middle East, that still isn't peace, right? So even that like biased Israeli narrative that likely would be what comes into the U.S. press and that most Americans hear, because that's all you hear during the second Intifada. That doesn't bode well for Trump's vision of the Middle East of cutting all these deals and making peace. So I think wait until after the election. I guess if Trump wins the election, I don't see there being like any hard press to get it done anytime soon. Trump loses the election, I could see the Israelis looking to get the ball rolling by the time Trump leaves office, just so this thing is already in motion, and whatever kind of bad behind the scenes stuff that Biden could help do to maybe slow down. Because I don't, as much as as you say, Joe Biden's Israel policy, no daylight between the U.S. and Israel under Joe Biden. I guess I would see Biden as working behind the scenes to have this not happen under his administration, just so again he doesn't have to deal with the fallout from the Palestinians realizing that a huge chunk of their land was stolen again, right? Like that's not something Biden wants, so I think he would fight behind the scenes to prevent it from happening. But if it was already in motion, I don't see him doing anything to stop it. That takes real effort in, diplomatic, skills and stuff like that.
Maybe courage or something too.
Right, yeah. I guess the other thing I maybe that would cause it to be delayed even further is I think Bibi Netanyahu will likely use it as an election issue, and so it won't really come up again till the next time he's ready to push an election, which maybe is next spring or this coming winter.
Instead of jail, maybe.
Yeah, right. So depending on how his corruption trial is going that he's in the middle of, there's a lot of factors here that could change the date and how annexation is going and everything. But the important thing is that the Abraham Accords, the UAE normalizing relations with Israel, wasn't at all a gift to the Palestinians like it was pretended to be. And for at least people to realize that the Palestinians got screwed in this deal, I think is important, because the narrative over and over again is the Palestinians just can't realize a good deal when it comes in front of their face. And even when somebody does them a favor, they spit in their face. And that's why the Palestinians are in this like people without a land position that they're in, when that's not the case at all. And but I'm sure that'll be the spin in the narrative coming out of most of this, but it's just not the truth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Will, anything else?
No, I think we hit all the bases there. Unfortunate, it's kind of a bad story, but
yeah. All right, well, everybody, if you're still listening to the show, I I know you really like it. So hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you're listening to it. If you can, give it a rating and review, thumbs up, like it on Facebook, Twitter. Retweets are very helpful. Shares on Facebook, all that kind of stuff. Find Will Porter on Twitter at the Will Porter. I'm Kyle Anzalone _. The Twitter handle for the show is at con_interest. The Facebook page is Conflicts of Interest. The YouTube channel, of course, Conflicts of Interest. Patreon.com/conflicts of interest. But you find everything if you go to the Libertarian Institute, which is where the show is hosted. And on the homepage there, you find the show. Click on it, you get the show notes, links to articles that me and Will think are important to read. And then you'll find all of these links there as well to make it really easy to subscribe and follow and like everything. So we really appreciate for those of you who are sharing the show. It is getting it out there to new listeners who are saying that they like the show and they appreciate people turning them on to it. So take the time to do that. And Will, anything else?
That's all, man.
All right. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, everybody. See you, Kyle.
See ya.